practice to advocate for better practices as well. Again, I was trying to think with students in mind for this presentation. And so for some of it, it might not be necessarily, it might not give you the answer for what to do if you feel like you're not receiving culturally or structurally responsive supervision. I know that was one of the things that came up. But I think it's important that we understand what culturally and structurally responsive supervision could look like and what we know works well and doesn't work well in supervision so that folks understand what they do deserve and what they do have a right to. And so that's what I'm aiming to arm you with today. So first, I want to talk a little bit about clinical supervision, which again might be review for a lot of you, especially in the supervision and training section. But the reality is that a lot of times we don't get really great clinical supervision education and training in some of our programs. Some folks do this really well, but sometimes there's not a lot of exposure to it. So I never like to assume that folks have gotten the basics about what clinical supervision is and isn't. And one of my favorite quotes that I think really drives home what the best of supervision is that it's a relationship about other relationships, right? It's multi-layered, it's complicated. There are a lot more parties involved than it might even seem. And it is first and foremost relational at every level. It's also a practice in its own right, with its own set of guidelines, competencies, theoretical orientations or approaches that are specific to clinical supervision. And so even if we have great training in psychotherapy, it's a great start. Those are foundational skills for clinical supervision. But there's also separate competencies, separate knowledge that it's important that we receive training in for clinical supervision. It's something I think it's important for trainees to know when they're out in the field is that, again, not everyone gets great training in clinical supervision. And as a result, we know that what supervision practice looks like out in the world is highly, highly variable. It's also complex, and best case scenario, it requires the supervisor to have strong meta awareness and meta knowledge. And we know that it's far reaching. This is the primary way that we transmit psychotherapy knowledge and skills. It is the best opportunity we have to help students grow and learn. It also directly impacts the current clients that are being supervised, and it indirectly impacts future clients by how we're helping the student develop or not helping them develop. And really crucially, supervision is not merely case consultation. That is more administrative supervision. So certainly it needs to be a part of it. We have to know what's going on with our supervisees' clients' cases, and we have to make sure that we have an eye on liability things and that we're having some sort of quality assurance eyes on the therapy that's being conducted or the services that are being provided. But supervision is that and more if we're truly talking about clinical supervision. And so, kind of to that point, the supervisor has three primary responsibilities. First and foremost is the supervisory relationship. Just like we know in psychotherapy, it's the relationship that accounts for much of change. We know that it is the supervisory relationship that accounts for much of change and that allows for other facilitative things to occur. So, the next two responsibilities, for example, attending to the supervisee's professional development as a therapist and monitoring and supporting the quality of psychotherapy provided to the client by the supervisee, those two responsibilities can really only be attended to adequately if we're coming from having a strong supervisory working alliance with our supervisee or with our supervisor. Without that, very difficult for us to attend to those other two responsibilities. And decades of research on various facets of these responsibilities have found again and again that supervisor behaviors and qualities have very predictable positive and negative consequences along each of these responsibilities. So, just as a snapshot of what we know about the literature, um, we know that, for example, cultural responsiveness and so cultural responsiveness as a positive indicator, but then also racial and gendered microaggressions as a negative indicator, as well as supervisee factors such as stress and anxiety, which can be exacerbated by lack of cultural responsiveness or experiencing microaggressions in supervision. That stress and anxiety have a negative impact on the supervisory working alliance. And that when we're able to talk about things like race and racism, gender and sexism in supervision, that this has a positive impact on the supervisory working alliance. And these are just some examples of things that we know from the literature. Ditto with the supervisor having a more advanced racial identity development level than the supervisee. And that matters because we know that the supervisory working alliance is related to a number of outcomes. The stronger the working alliance, the more likely that the supervisee is going to be willing to talk about difficult things with their supervisor. Sometimes that even means clinical mistakes. And so if supervisees feel like they can't tell us what's going on, again, we can't attend to our other responsibilities, helping them with their development, monitoring the care that's being provided. When the supervisory working alliance is strong, supervisees are more satisfied with supervision, and it's related to a host of other positive personal and professional outcomes. So, on the basis of all of this literature, some time ago, Ellis and colleagues created what they called the harmful and inadequate model of clinical supervision. And as part of that, they defined what minimally adequate clinical supervision is. Again, emphasis on minimally adequate, right? And that includes a number of different indicators, but among those is being attentive to multicultural and diversity issues in supervision, as well as in the psychotherapy that's being provided, and being aware of and attentive to the power differential and boundaries between the supervisee and the supervisor, and how that power differential and boundaries affect the supervisory relationship. Once again, as you can see, this includes case review, but that is only a small proportion of minimally adequate supervision. So if we are not attending to these things in clinical supervision, we are not even providing or receiving minimally adequate clinical supervision. And I think it's really important to understand that. On the flip side, we have inadequate and harmful supervision, which can also be defined by the lack of minimally adequate clinical supervision, right? But we also know that there are more specific indicators of harmful and inadequate supervision. So on the inadequate side, that can include inattention to a supervisee's concerns or struggles, the supervisor not listening or not being open to the supervisee's opinions, or being unwilling or unable to meet those minimally adequate criteria, including things like attention to cultural issues and the power differential. And there's also harmful supervision. And that is usually supervisory practices that result in psychological, emotional, or physical harm or trauma to the supervisee. This includes things that I hope would be really obvious, like sexual transgressions or using drugs or alcohol with the supervisor, very real things that have showed up in some of those studies. But also included in harmful clinical supervision are things like microaggressions and invalidation of cultural issues. So as we can see, there's some basis in the clinical supervision literature for recognizing that it's really important that we attend to cultural and, I would add, structural issues in clinical supervision. But how can we understand what that looks like and what do we know from the literature? There's been a shift in the past decade or so toward a multicultural orientation model of culturally responsive psychotherapy and supervision. And the authors choose the word orientation there really intentionally, as opposed to a more skill-based competence model, because they describe multicultural orientation as a way of being the way that we are in the relationship that is psychotherapy or that is supervision, as opposed to something that we do. It's more of a process model that's grounded in the contextual model of psychotherapy that again recognizes that empirically it's the relationship that accounts for much of the outcome in psychotherapy. One of the nice things about this model is that it helps better account for intersectionality, because I know early in my career when I was more focused on multicultural competence and I was teaching it in classes or I was doing workshops on it, folks would either demonstrate or sometimes be able to articulate some overwhelm when we start to introduce intersectionality, right? Because from that lens, we need to learn this literature and this literature and this literature. But as you start sort of adding identities, right? In the additive model of intersectionality there, then the number of literatures that we feel like we need to know in order to be minimally competent to see anyone who walks in our door becomes very overwhelming very quickly. And it can cause people to sort of withdraw or shut down. Whereas multicultural orientation, part of the theorizing is that if we're strong in MCO, then it motivates people to learn what they need to learn when they need to learn it. There's less, ideally, anxiety wrapped up in, I need to know all of these things beforehand. It recognizes that not knowing is a part of the process and motivates us to learn as we go. So to me, I've come to see these as sort of like modern core conditions, like Rogers' unconditional positive regard and empathy. They are necessary for good psychotherapy, necessary for good supervision. Does that mean that they're fully sufficient and that, it ends there? Not necessarily, and we'll get back to that in a little bit, but we know that they are minimally necessary for good relationships, and we'll see what the research says about that in just a moment. So, multicultural orientation is rooted in four assumptions: that clients and therapists co create cultural expressions, or that therapy, individual therapy, is a two-person endeavor. And I know that might seem like, well, obviously, right? There's two people in the therapy room in individual therapy, it's a two-person endeavor. But that's articulated to kind of push back against the therapist as invisible or not a participant, right? We are a person in that relationship, and our very presence and our positionality influences that dynamic. And it's really important that we remember that. That again, MCO is a way of being rather than a way of doing. That cultural processes are critical to connecting with clients regarding their most salient identities or positionality. And that strong MCO motivates therapists to learn new things about clients' cultural perspectives and worldviews. Cultural related knowledge is necessary in therapy, but we can't learn it all in advance. And there are three pillars that constitute multicultural orientation: cultural humility, which is considered the central organizing pillar, cultural opportunities, and cultural comfort. So, with cultural humility being the central organizing construct of MCO, this is probably where we have the most empirical research. And we consider cultural humility to have two facets: interpersonal, which is being very other oriented, curious, perspective taking, lacking a sense of superiority in all of our interactions; and intrapersonal, having an accurate view of oneself. And that does especially include our own limitations, but it includes our strengths as well. It's not purely self-denigration, it's having a true, accurate sense of what are my strengths and my weaknesses. Cultural comfort is considered to be the therapist's or supervisor's thoughts or feelings that emerge before, during, or after conversations about the client's identities or culturally focused content. And cultural comfort, or just should say cultural opportunities, I apologize, are like cultural markers that occur in therapy. So these could be behavioral expressions of cultural humility or cultural comfort. Um, and Davis and colleagues argue that these are always there. It's just that the stronger we are in multicultural orientation, the better we are able to recognize them when they're present and actually usefully attend to them in therapy or in supervision. So, cultural humility requires that we have a good understanding of our own values and our own beliefs, that we take a very other oriented stance intentionally, that we maintain respect and lack of superiority in all interactions. And I emphasize that all interactions part because it's not really something that you should be able to turn on or off, right? This is a quality that we develop and that we demonstrate. And so if we are really great to our professional colleagues that share our similar degree and title, but then we take a superiority stance with administrative staff, I would argue that's not very humble or culturally humble, right? So it's that maintaining respect and lack of superiority in all interactions, approaching things collaboratively, expressing and genuinely feeling curiosity and interest, and asking questions rather than making assumptions when we are uncertain. So cultural humility isn't, to me, it's another one of those things that sounds obvious, right? Like, of course, these things would be good in therapy, in supervision, but it also can be harder than it seems, and some things can make it more difficult. Cultural humility is easiest to demonstrate when we feel like there's more similarities between us and the person who we're working with, and it can be hardest when differences are greater or when we feel attacked or deficient in some way, essentially when we're feeling some kind of defensiveness, right? So it's important that we be attentive to that in ourselves. Cultural comfort, again, the thoughts and feelings that emerge during conversations about identity, race, culture. And this is characterized by, we usually talk about it as feelings of calm or ease. I would argue relative calm or ease, right? Because sometimes these conversations are difficult. So it's not about that we're zen about everything, right? But that our level of activation is lower. And that allows us to stay more genuinely engaged with others who are coming from different positionalities or who have different experiences than we do, or even sometimes when we're experiencing overalignment. It helps facilitate our ability to recognize and create cultural opportunities, which is what comes next. But being higher in cultural humility also helps facilitate the development of cultural comfort. And as I mentioned, we can understand cultural opportunities as kind of markers that occur in therapy. There's a similar sort of construct in several psychotherapy theories. In EFT, we talk about it as markers. In Tabor and Tabor's interpersonal process, we talk about it as points of entry. Or Yalom talks about having and developing the here and now rabbit ears for recognizing these markers in psychotherapy. And so all of those are kind of capturing the same thing. Cultural opportunities is just a culturally specific version of those markers or those points of entry. So the more that we can facilitate cultural humility and through that cultural comfort, and we can be more present and truly listening for what's said and not said in therapy or supervision, the more that we're going to be able to recognize and take advantage of those cultural opportunities. So this can be a moment of intentional action on the part of the therapist or the supervisor to initiate a cultural discussion or to follow the client or supervisee's lead. Or alternatively, we can miss that opportunity and pursue another point of interest entirely and avoid talking about those things. So we know from the research that cultural humility, cultural comfort, and cultural opportunities have been found again and again to have positive effects on process and outcome in both psychotherapy and clinical supervision. The research is clear that these things are important. So how can we strive to develop them? Some colleagues and I, led by Stephanie Winklejohn Black, have recently argued that developing cultural humility involves four key ingredients: working on developing that accurate sense of self, learning to receive feedback mindfully, even when it's different. And again, we see that sort of like trying to lower activation kind of thing. Having a heightened interpersonal awareness, which certainly it's easier to develop that when we can feel more present in the relationship, and maintaining openness and curiosity toward others. As part of that, I think something that's really important to consider is what I've come to call critical self-compassion. And I know that that sounds like an oxymoron, but bear with me. It comes from the recognition that we can't possibly know everything. We can't know other people's experiences. We can't know things that we were never taught, right? There are going to be things that catch us off guard, that we get wrong, or that we don't know. And worse yet, we can't know what we don't know a lot of the time, which increases the likelihood that things will be imperfect or that we will make mistakes. Critical self-compassion encourages us to have care and patience for ourselves and whatever reactions that we might be having, while simultaneously balancing that with holding ourselves accountable, exercising curiosity for where our reaction might be originating from, and allowing ourselves to feel what we're feeling without acting out toward others, without acting from that place of defensiveness or whatever is coming up for us, right? So it does the both and, or it encourages us to do the both and. We feel what we feel. And as therapists, we all know that if you're feeling a big feeling and it feels like the only response is to just kind of like stuff it down, shove it down, that it's going to erupt in some way, shape, or form, right? So we know that making that just go away is not a tenable solution. And at the same time, it is important for us to critically interrogate why this is coming up for us, especially where power is involved, right? So for me as a white woman, if we're having conversations about race and I'm feeling those big emotions, I need to be able to recognize that that's happening, take a deep breath and a pause, and allow myself, some grace for the fact that I'm having that emotion and it's coming from somewhere. Lots of history and learning or lack of learning in some cases, but also have the presence of mind to not react from that place and to respond more mindfully and from a more centered place and critically interrogate what that's about for me before making it about something or somebody else. These qualities are really important because ruptures will happen. This is just the nature of relationships. They will happen in therapy. We know they do. They will happen in clinical supervision. We know that they do. But when we're stronger in multicultural orientation and we're better able to exercise that critical self-compassion, we're more willing to admit our mistakes. We're more open. We are more relationship oriented. And so it speaks to the crucial nature of fostering MCO and being able to attend to those ruptures. And so when we're feeling those big feelings or when ruptures happen, it's important that we be aware of what's coming up for us. That's the attend to ourselves part. Attend to any unconscious interpersonal dynamics, again, including our own role in that. Be mindful about and attend to the role of power dynamics, especially in clinical supervision. Be aware of and attend to our limits, and adopt a stance of lifelong learning, which is core to cultural humility, that no matter how much you learn, there will always be more to learn. We will never at any point know everything. So to be able to demonstrate all of those things, it means that we have to learn to tolerate ambiguity, tolerate not knowing. We need to have excellent emotion regulation skills as best possible. We have to have patience with imperfection, and I would argue expect imperfection because I feel like as therapists, we know imperfection is the norm. We know that perfection is impossible until it's us sometimes, right? Like, yeah, it's perfection's not possible for everybody else, but for me, perfection's possible, which is not super congruent with humility or cultural humility, right? The willingness to be wrong, sometimes even publicly, like in group supervision or a classroom. The importance of critiquing is crucial to remember. Critiquing the status quo, critiquing what we've been taught, whether formally or informally, and critiquing our initial perceptions of people, of dynamics, of events that happen. We have to be willing to have hard discussions. And a great example of how the things that sort of motivate us to avoid hard discussions is that I often find that people are very anxious about initiating cultural discussions, especially in psychotherapy. What if I bring it up and it's not relevant for the client? What if I bring it up and they're upset in some way? And certainly those things are possible. It could happen, right? And again, we know if there's a rupture, there are ways that we can attend to those things. But most of the time, if it doesn't fit for a client or it doesn't fit for the supervisee and we bring it up, it usually is like, that's not really important. And then they move on, right? But I can tell you from our clinical supervision studies, when we ask supervisees and especially supervisees of color, what was the most harmful thing that happened in clinical supervision, not having the discussion, not talking about it when race or culture could have or should have entered the room explicitly is routinely noted as one of the things that's most harmful. And similarly, one of the things that's routinely mentioned as most helpful is having those discussions. And so we tend to be most anxious, or at least especially beginning therapists, but some folks, even beyond that, folks tend to be most anxious about what if I bring it up and that was wrong? When in reality, what tends to be felt most acutely by people is when we don't have those discussions. And finally, being willing to learn new information when needed and seeking it out ourselves is another core piece of fostering multicultural orientation. So again, at this point, we have over 20 studies in psychotherapy with over 6,000 psychotherapy clients. We're nearing at least 10 supervision studies with hundreds of supervisees. And we find over and over again that cultural humility, cultural comfort, and cultural opportunities have positive effects on both process and outcome in clinical supervision. However, our research also demonstrates that clearly racial microaggressions still occur, even when supervisors demonstrate high cultural humility, which does serve as a buffer. It's protective of the supervisory relationship, but it still has a detrimental effect and it's still happening, right? And In our studies, supervisees of color especially have highlighted the need for didactics and discussion, not on, as much on quote unquote cultural differences, but on systemic and structural oppression. And doing this research for many years now, this is the most common and consistent criticism that I often run into about the MCO model. And, as I've been doing this work, thinking about the both and of MCO and what, right? I've thought a lot about this quote by Dr. Tama Bryant, who was at the time president of APA. And she said, when we lack courage in our language, our actions will lack courage. And I think it's really important that we center what she's saying here and that we try to remember it every day, because I think it's really easy to not be very clear about what it is that we're really talking about, right? And so for myself, I've been trying to shift more toward talking about culture when we're talking about culture, and talking about racism and oppression when we're talking about racism and oppression, right? Because keeping it in the eye for myself, right? I am a cis het white woman from a lower socioeconomic background who has disabilities, right? So speaking for myself personally, ableism, classism, sexism, these things are not my culture. Social class is part of my culture, right? But ableism, classism, sexism, these are things I have to contend with. They're things that happen to me. They're systems that shape the world that I have to live in, right? And ditto with other systems of oppression. And it's so important to be clear and specific in our language when we're talking about these things. And I've appreciated that the APA has been making great strides in having that courage in their language and giving us some guidance on what that needs to look like. In 2021, the APA adopted several policy resolutions that have defined how psychologists should understand racism and our role in addressing it, including starting with structural racism and considering that and institutional racism, along with the things that we've tended to be better at, which is interpersonal and internalized. They adopted several more council resolutions, including our first apology to people of color in the US, which, while people tend to be aware of the apology, less appreciated is the historical chronology document that was commissioned alongside of that apology that basically walks through all the ways that psychology and the APA have had a significant role in shaping racial hierarchy in the United States. For me, as someone who's also a testing psychologist, I can't ignore that it reads like a history of cognitive assessment, right? And so even if you're aware of the apology, check out the historical chronology document. I think it should be required reading for our entire field. The role of psychology and the APA in dismantling racism against people of color. There was a resolution on advancing health equity. And in 2023, we even had a policy statement in response to the Supreme Court decision overturning equitable admissions in higher education. So we see this sort of increasing presence of courage in our language, right? So multicultural orientation helps focus on the processes in psychotherapy, right? The focus is on a way of being rather than a way of doing. Just speaking for myself personally, I see this very much as the skills portion of cultural and structural responsiveness, because so much of therapeutic skill, and that includes in clinical supervision, is about being rather than doing. But this, needs to be combined with some kind of knowledge and awareness as well. But of what, right? And to me, this is where structural competence comes in. Grzenka argued in 2020 that we should consider adopting from medical education the structural competencies model as started to be articulated by Metzel and Hansen. And at the time, they stated that medical education, and I would argue the same is true of psychology education, is misdirected to focus on the individual and cross-cultural understanding, rather than, or at least not to the exclusion of, also focusing on and learning about social and systemic forces, their historical antecedents, and how those result in the individual mental health outcomes, in our case, that we seek to actually help people with. So there are 5 principles of structural competence. 1, recognizing the structures that shape clinical interactions. And what's meant by this is, how do these systems of oppression How have they contributed to why we're having this interaction at all, right? Whether it's how have these structures shaped why this person is struggling with their mental health, or I think often about like the testing children context and how have systems of oppression influenced why this child has been referred for services and in the manner that they have and with the labels, the assumed labels that they're coming in with. Developing an extra clinical language of structure. When I'm teaching cognitive assessment, I'm often teaching about the history of redlining, how that has led to de facto segregation in the United States, and how that has continued to impact disparities in K through 12 education to this day, right? Almost nothing I just said is a psychological term. I am pulling from education, I am pulling from history, I am pulling from law to explain those things. But it's crucial for folks to have that knowledge and that lens to be able to engage in adequate case conceptualization and try to avoid engaging in more harm in that interaction. Learning to rearticulate cultural presentations in structural terms, observing and imagining structural intervention, much of which overlaps with a lot of the advocacy that we talk about in counseling psych, and developing structural humility, which means that psychology doesn't have all the answers. Counseling psych doesn't have all the answers. We need to work interdisciplinarily and together to be able to learn from one another, to bring complex understandings and complex solutions to complex problems. See if I can get my slide to advance here. There we go. Okay. So in that 2020 article, Brzezinski called for psychologists to consider structural and systemic forces. And some of the questions that he encouraged us to ask include, what role does inequality play in this situation? How can I address constructs and systems, not just identities? How is social power operating in this situation? And what role can psychologists play in addressing this social problem? So what might taking a structural lens to things look like? There's a few examples here, but in our context, I would encourage us to take a look at this last one, right? Something that I hear a lot in the other research that I do some research on inequity in higher education. And I hear a lot that lower socioeconomic status students or first gen students just need better quote unquote financial literacy. This has always driven me mad because my experience has been that often lower SES students can run circles around folks in terms of their financial literacy and their understanding because they've had to learn, right? And so that is blaming the individual for a structural problem rather than focusing on the cumulative economic, physical, and psychological effects of systemic classism and economic oppression. And so here we see an example that structural competencies don't just apply in the psychotherapy context, right? It is a way of understanding the world around us, and that includes the supervisees, the trainees that we might work with as supervisors. So what happens when supervision is not culturally and or structurally responsive? And in some of our qualitative work, we've been able to capture that structural component a little bit better. And what we find again and again is that when supervision is not culturally or structurally responsive, supervisees withhold important information, their professional development is inhibited. It results in mental health detriments to the supervisees. And it can also result in lack of cultural and structural responsiveness to the clients that are being served. So cultural and structural responsiveness can be understood as a process of unlearning as much as learning or relearning, right? We're taught a lot of incomplete, problematic histories by these systems of oppression, and it's easy to take that for granted. And so, yes, there are some things that we need to learn. There's knowledge that we need to develop, but just as important in that process is unlearning all the things that we have been taught by systems of oppression. It's also important that therapists and supervisor factors such as critical consciousness be considered. And really, when we're talking about learning, having awareness, developing knowledge about these systems of oppression, that's a part of what we're talking about is the development of critical consciousness. We know from some other literature outside of supervision that critical consciousness has important positive mental health effects. And I would argue that it's just as important in clinical supervision as well. And it's important that we be aware not just of the quote unquote cultural differences between us, which is still important, but that we also be aware of our intersectional positionalities as it pertains to white supremacy and interlocking systems of oppression, the ways in which we and our supervisees might have different relationships with systems of power, and how that is influencing the relationship, how we might exacerbate that or do things to try to mitigate it and minimize the power differential. So I wanted to make sure to leave some time for Q&A, although certainly I can elaborate on some things as well. But very often I just wind up talking quite a bit. And I wanted to try not to do that here as much, even though it has still been a while. And so I would love to hear, any questions or thoughts that folks have, but also feel free to save my contact information if folks would like to follow up later. Yeah.
You so
So
much. So we have two questions, and then so if anyone from the audience has any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them. First question is, can we have the slides?
yeah, absolutely. I can share those to, do we have a list of registrants from this? We probably do, right?
Good.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides for everyone.
And then the other question was, could you share the historical chronological document that you had referenced as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can both send that out and also, I don't know if I think I'm a co-host, so I think I can chat everyone.
The chat, yeah, perfect. Okay. And so one question that a student had given to me when we were developing this webinar is, how would you recommend that supervisees engage in some of these conversations with supervisors when it feels like supervisors are missing some of this stuff and you feel like it takes away from your supervision experience, but you're also being mindful that there's more risk to you as the supervisee to bring it up?
Yes, I remember you brought that question up when we were first talking about this too. And of course, I don't explicitly address it in the presentation because it's very, very tough, right? Because do you want the ideal world answer or the real world answer? That's what's tough.
On everything.
Yeah. Ideally, in a perfect world, we can try to approach our supervisors in a relational way and put our therapist hat on and what we know about good communication and share what's working and not working for us and ask for a collaborative way forward, which could even include sharing resources with a supervisor, right? I wonder if you would be willing to read this with me or that with me, things like that. But we also know that, psychologists are human, supervisors are human, and we run the gamut on where we're at identity development wise in multiple ways. We run the gamut on, where we're at interpersonally, on stressors in our lives, right? And that's why I'm always really hesitant to just jump into assuming like, oh, here are these things, go have this conversation with your supervisor, right? Because I'm also aware that if I say, oh, here's how to go have this conversation with your supervisor, right? And somebody tries it and they encounter substantial defensiveness, that can also be really harmful then to that supervisee, which then can be harmful to clients, right? And so there's this really tough tension because supervisors vary widely. And I was about to say you don't know what you're going to get. That might not be entirely true. I don't know what you're going to get. You might know what you're going to get, right? You know your supervisor better than I ever could, your current supervisors and whomever you have in the future, right? So in some ways, each of you is the only person who can truly know how to best approach your particular supervisor to have a conversation about what's working and what's not, or what some of your concerns are. And then that has implications for how you would approach it or whether it's approachable, right? But I think one of the biggest protective factors is find the mentors in your life who you do feel like are stronger in these qualities, where you can have these hard discussions, right? Because one thing I will say is that you shouldn't struggle alone when you feel as though you are in a supervision situation that feels either unsatisfying or even unsafe to you. Like most things in our professional life, consult, consult, consult is the answer, and that includes peer consultation. That's absolutely crucial. But a good mentor who you trust and who you can talk out, like, here's the exact situation. This is what I'm encountering. This is what's being said and done. And we can put our psychologist hat on to try to like understand what factors might be at play. And that can help us try to guide you as mentors a little bit more precisely about how to handle a specific circumstance because supervisors vary so widely in how they might respond. You know, I hope that at this point in my life, I say to clients and to supervisees, I will make mistakes. I'm not going to try to make mistakes, but because I'm an imperfect person, it's going to happen. So my goal here isn't to strive for perfection. My goal is to try to foster a relationship where we can talk about the things that are imperfect and you know what you're going to get from me. And it's not going to be defensiveness and it's not going to be, punishment or anything. It's going to be care and collaboration because that's my priority. And so, find the folks who you have that kind of relationship with, where you can talk about those hard things and it's not going to elicit defensiveness, so that you can see whether a resolution is possible, or how to best kind of pursue it. Do you think that kind of answers the question, Jenny?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I know it's hard without individual context, and it's also different depending on what the context is. So,
Yeah,
another question we had was, can you elaborate on how we focus on systemic issues with supervisees?
sure. That also looks like a number of things, but I think, if I'm thinking about the qualitative data that we have from supervisees and what some of those responses have looked like, I, to my recollection, I have heard that come out as I wish that we were talking about this as it relates to our clients. I wish we were getting more didactics on systems of oppression and understanding how that influences our clients presenting problems. And both through data like that and anecdotally, I certainly hear quite a bit about how supervisees wish that their supervisors understood them from that perspective as well. A great example actually is a study that we are about to embark on, and that is actually around political safety in clinical supervision. And that is very much more structural than cultural, right? But if supervisees don't feel politically safe with their supervisor, they're struggling with the things that are happening right now, but they don't know if they don't know how their supervisor is going to respond about the distress that they might be feeling about everything that's going on, or they do know and it's not great, then they're more likely to not talk about those things. And, we've also had discussions about then sometimes students feel stranded in terms of like, well, my client is also bringing these up in therapy. They're really distressed by everything that's going on. And I don't know where to go with this. I don't know how to talk about these systems and structures of oppression in therapy. But then if I can't talk to my supervisor about it, where am I supposed to get support on how to support my client? Not to mention I'm struggling with it myself, right? So it still comes down to the talking about it, but are we talking about cultural differences between us, or are we talking about how we're all contending with these systems and structures of oppression right now? And those are very different things. Um, and so I would say the talking about it, helping students learn about systems and structures of oppression and their relationship with mental health, learn what interventions help with folks in that context, right? The critical consciousness being a great example of something that we can attend to in both therapy and supervision, and recognizing that these systems impact our supervisees too, and being careful to not interpret our supervisees' behavior through a lens of individuality without recognizing how they're contending with those systems and structures, if that makes sense.
You. Another question is, do you have any recommendations on how a younger supervisor of color can address MCO with a white supervisee who is older?
Okay, white supervisee who is older. Oh, that is complicated dynamics, right? And even on the research side, we talk about how so much research is on when the supervisee is coming from a more marginalized positionality, but very little, not none to my recollection, but very little on when the supervisor holds a marginalized positionality and the supervisee comes from a more privileged position. So I'm just aware of that lack of empirical exploration as I answer this question. Um, And again, it's hard to answer because I don't know anything about in a hypothetical situation, what does this person's defensiveness look like? What does their racial identity development look like? What other messages are they getting or not getting from other classes, right? Are you the only one who is working with them on the importance of multicultural orientation? Or is this a message that's coming from multiple supervisors, other classes, a whole program? And all of those things change the long algebraic equation of, what is the sort of output of what would be the most successful strategy here, Um, Part of why I emphasize the research component is because sometimes that can be at least a little bit disarming. The research is there and it's robust. And so when we can say, like, the research is super clear that this is very, very important for psychotherapy and in supervision, and it's detrimental when it's not there, then folks will sometimes open up a bit more. But if you're talking about, I'm seeing something like a growth edge or a limitation in a supervisee, and the power dynamics are making that harder to challenge, as opposed to just like a general, like, oh, everyone's doing fine. I just think it's important that they know this. That gets really challenging, right? Because if, by definition, if you think that you are seeing cultural humility and cultural comfort as a growth edge, we'll say, then by definition, trying to talk about it may elicit defensiveness. And that is a difficult catch-22, right? As I'm talking out loud about this, I will simply say that some of the things I have found to be helpful over the years is naming that up front, that these are very difficult things to talk about, that people have very strong reactions sometimes to these things. And, it's okay to have strong reactions in here, but let's talk about it, right? Let's talk about those strong reactions. Um, and even pulling at the idea of critical self-compassion, that's where that came out of, is working with a lot of defensiveness, particularly with white folks, and trying to find ways to disarm that defensiveness. That's where the critical self-compassion thing came from. And so sometimes even pulling at some of that literature, but it is a difficult catch-22 to get out of sometimes, especially if you feel as though power is in some ways working against you in the supervisory relationship, because you're, by definition, if we're talking about limitations, working with defensiveness, right? I know that's an incomplete answer, but it's tough to answer.
Wow, thank you. And we're coming down to time, and there's still a few more questions. So are you okay to take one more, or do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to take
Okay.
whatever we have time
Uh,
for.
so the other question is, what specific recommendations do you have for new supervisors and setting up supervisory relationships and teams?
Mm, good question. I think that, for one, Alice and colleagues have argued that having a supervisory contract can be really important. And, it's a bit formal, and it's, joke with my supervisor, it's the only formal thing that I really do is having that contract. Um, but to me, one of the most important things about it is, for the one that I use, appended to that contract is a document of supervisee rights and responsibilities, which also came out of Dr. Ellis's research lab and his work. And it's a reminder, like I always tell students, like, I know that you have responsibilities in supervision, but you have rights also. And I want you to have this supervisee bill of rights and responsibilities so that you know that you have rights in your relationship with me, but also so that you can keep this in your files and always remember in any supervisory relationship that you have responsibilities as a supervisee, but you also have rights as a supervisee. And that includes a right to adequate and responsive clinical supervision. And so starting out with those things can be really important. And then like so much else that we do in psychotherapy and supervision, starting by emphasizing the relationship, right? Um, what are your own hopes and expectations for the semester or for the year as a supervisor? What types of discussions do you hope to be able to have with them? What are you going to do to try to demonstrate safety um, and that the priority is the relationship in order to facilitate having those discussions, acknowledging the role of power in that, right? Because while I would love for us to be able to talk about everything and having maximum safety, the reality is that supervision is still an evaluative role. right? There's still a grade. I'm still a gatekeeper to this profession. And so the power imbalance can't be zero. And as a result, there's always going to be those limitations. But if we can acknowledge that out loud, talk about it, and just recognize that we want to have a strong supervisory working alliance, even with those limits and that power differential, I think naming those things up front can do a lot to help establish a stronger relationship.
Thank you so much for all this. I know it's these are all really complex things and trying to figure out how do we do all of this in the best way possible for the supervisee or the client or whoever's in front of us. We had some requests to, if you're willing to share your supervision contract.
Sure, I'm gonna probably make it more of a generic template, but I can do that. And so I have three things on my list. I have the historical chronology. I know I put in the chat, but I want to make sure people have that. I have the slides and I have the supervision contract.
Thank you so much. So we'll make sure that this gets sent out to everyone who registered for today. And we're out of time. So thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox, for joining us and sharing your expertise. And um, your contact information is in the slides. So if people need anything, you have that. If you are interested in any more of Dr. Wilcox's research or initiatives as D17 president, be sure to be on the listservs looking out for those. And then if you're interested in learning more about supervision and training, you are free to join the supervision and training section of D17. We have no cost to join. We have no membership fees. So you can sign up for that on our website. But thank you again, everyone who was here, and hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for being here.